All right, folks, let's wrap up the notes on World War One. As we were talking earlier about the two-front war that Germany had to fight, they had to fight on the Eastern Front against Russia, and on the Western Front, they were fighting in a stalemate, the trench warfare with France, and England, and Belgium. And then eventually by 1917, after the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann Telegraph, they're fighting with the U.S. too. And that really makes a big difference, because when the U.S. comes in, it's going to be basically turn all the tides to the war. So, but the break they're going to catch on the Eastern Front, the Russians are going to leave the war. By 1917, Russia was in turmoil. They had a very unpopular Tsar and Tsar Nicholas II, and a lot of conflict that was going on there. And you're going to have what's called the Bolshevik Revolution, essentially a communist revolution in Russia. And this is really the first time that communism, in as a whole, is going to take off and really take control of an entire country. So because of this, Vladimir Lenin, who you'll get in the Russian Revolution notes, is going to come in and sign a treaty with the Germans, basically removing Russia from the war, called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And the communists are going to leave, and there's going to be conflict in Russia that's going on. There's going to be civil war before they fully take over. But needless to say, the Russian army is going to be out. So that's going to be beneficial for the Germans, because they're going to make a full push back towards the Western Front again. But by that time, the Germans are too weak to defeat the Allies. The resources that the Germans needed, they just didn't have, and the losses were too great. So the Germans decide, along with the British, the French, the Americans, to end this war. So on November 11th, I'll skip the video for now. On November 11th, 1918, it's considered the armistice. At the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, they halt, they stop. And I need you to underline the word armistice and a halt in arms. It's basically ending the war with, not officially, the treaty has to end it, the Treaty of Versailles has to end it, but basically this war is done. All right? And the soldiers get out by their trenches and just go home. They get back on trains and they go home. There had been so much death and destruction that they didn't want to fight anymore anyway, so they just got up and left. And they were sad but happy in the same regard, okay? But really now we got to focus on the Treaty of Versailles, because that's what's going to be the turning point that not only ends World War I, but really basically starts World War II. So here we go. The key to this is going to be Woodrow Wilson and the Americans. This is going to be the first time a sitting president has left the United States and gone overseas to negotiate a treaty. And Woodrow Wilson's going to do that in Paris, or outside of Paris at Versailles, where he's going to present what is called the 14 points to France, England, Italy, Japan, but not to Germany. Germany is actually not even going to be invited to the Treaty of Versailles. So ironically enough, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Turks, the three countries that were the main combatants for the Central Powers who lost the war, aren't even invited to the treaty. And of course, everything's going to be geared towards crushing Germany, and especially when it comes down to England and France wanting to get rid of Germany. Okay, so here's what the 14 points basically say. Let me move my face up here so you guys can see. Number one is there are not going to be any secret treaties anymore. That's a direct response to the alliance issue, one of the main causes being the alliance issue. If you're going to create a treaty, you got to do it with everybody knowing, and that's just what's going to happen. The second one is freedom of the seas. And of course, that's because of the unrestricted submarine warfare by the German U-boats. Excuse me. Number three is going to be free trade, and allow for free trade to go around Europe. Number four is a big one, so put a star next to that. Reduce the armies of Germany. They're going to demilitarize Germany. Again, going back to that militarism cause of World War I. But now you have the demilitarization of Germany, and that's going to be a big issue, because when Hitler comes into power, he's going to remilitarize Germany. Number five, colonial claims are adjusted in Europe and in Africa, and you have a lessening of the power of Germany and a strengthening of the power of France and England. Number 6 through 13 really define new borders and new nations. I'll show you a map here at the end of what post-World War I Europe looks like compared to pre-World War I Europe. And you can see a lot of new countries and a lot of new lines being drawn. But the really big one, the one you need to underline, highlight, and know, is point number 14. Create an organization that's going to peacefully negotiate contracts. And that's the big deal, because never had really Europe or the world seen an organization that's going to act as kind of a world police force, but really meant to peacefully negotiate as opposed to going to war. And this will be the first real attempt at peace in the world when it comes to these problems, these issues. And this great war that just happened is now considered the war that's meant to end all wars, okay? And that's a big deal as we move forward. All right, so another part was Germany had to pay reparations. They had to pay money. That's what reparations is, money back to France and England in the tune of $89 billion. As a matter of fact, they just got done repaying this money back in 2011. The irony is Italy, who was part of the Allied group, who was very, very much involved in the war and winning the war, is left out of it completely. And that's going to be a problem, because Italy is going to be destroyed. It's going to be poor. Its economy is going to be wrecked. And it's going to lead to the rise of Mussolini. Okay, so you can see where a lot of mistakes are being made during the Treaty of Versailles, where Italy's being left out, Mussolini's going to take over. You demilitarize and make Germany pay, it's going to lead to the rise of Hitler. Japan is going to be shunned. When they sit down at the table to figure out what they want, nobody's going to even deal with them because they don't speak one of the European languages, or they don't speak English, and they're going to be kicked out. And of course, they're going to turn into the Axis powers. And a big reason why these three countries really turn around against the Allies is because of the mistakes made at the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so point 14 is the key. The organization that's going to be created is what's called the League of Nations. And that's what you need to underline here. This is going to be the precursor to what is called the United Nations like we have today. Big problem with the League of Nations, though, is it's not going to have a military force to back it. And even more importantly, it's not going to have the United States involved. And that's the irony to the League of Nations, is that the person who comes up with the League of Nations is President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. But when he returns back to the United States, the Treaty of Versailles is not even ratified by the Senate, which is what our Constitution says it needs to do. And because the Senate does not agree to the treaty, the United States is not involved. So even though the war is over, the U.S. essentially is saying, you're welcome for us helping you, but we're not going to get involved in any more of your conflicts again. So essentially, because of this, the League of Nations is going to fall apart. It's not going to be worth anything. It's not going to be very strong. And when it comes to the issues of World War II, the League of Nations can't do anything. And that's going to be a big problem down the road. And that's a big reason why Hitler and Mussolini and even the communists in Russia are going to be able to take such great control and not be able to be stopped. Okay, so understand, even though the World War I was meant to be the war that ends all wars, it doesn't do it. And there's too many mistakes being made as we look at why the war happened, how the war ends, and what the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to do, and what it actually doesn't do. France and England take advantage of Germany by charging them essentially $89 billion for their what they consider their mistake. Italy left out, Japan left out, Germany not even invited. Why do you think we're going to have a World War II? And that's a big deal. So let me pause this real quick. I want to find you a few maps and some numbers, and we'll look at those when we come back. Okay, here's a few maps to show you kind of how Europe has changed. You can see here on the left-hand map, the Triple Entente countries are there in orange. The Central Powers countries are here in the pink, and the neutral countries are there in the blue. And you can see how big and how few countries there actually are that are involved pre-World War I, but if you look here on the right, you can see how many new countries are really going to be there. You can see very much how the Austro-Hungarian Empire is no longer. They have been broken down and have turned into independent states, independent countries. Germany is much smaller than it had been originally. Russia, and there's new countries here along the Russian border. So there's a lot of major changes that have happened because of the issues. You can see the new state of Yugoslavia down here as opposed to Montenegro and Serbia. It's one giant country now. So Europe has changed dramatically after World War I, and one thing Hitler's going to try to do is reclaim this land, and we'll get to that when we get to Hitler. The last thing I want you to look at here is some numbers, okay? If you look at the grand total of people that fought in World War I in the countries here, you can see that over 65 million combatants partook in World War I. Of that 65 million, 8.5 million were killed, 21.1 million were wounded, 7.8 million essentially were taken prisoner, which gives you a grand total of about 37.5 million people that partook in World War I became a casualty, which is a grand total of almost 58% either died, were wounded, or were killed. Died, wounded, or put in prisoner or missing during this war. And you can see the numbers where Russia, they sent 12 million people off to war, Germany 11 million. Every single male was conscripted into the army. They had to go fight. The British Empire, 8.9 million. You had Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, anybody that was part of the British Empire fought for the British Empire, regardless of whether or not they were involved. Okay, they had to go off and fight. And 34% or 35.8% there. 73% of French that went off were a casualty in the war. Even with the Americans, we were there for 1 year. 4.3 million soldiers go off, 323,000 total casualties. 7% of the men who went off to war did not return. And you can see those numbers. Here, the Austro-Hungarians, out of the 7.8 million people that went off to war, 7 million were casualties. That's 90% of their population. And this is the reason this time period, post-World War I, going into the 1920s, is what's called the lost generation, because so many men were casualties of this war that they had lost them. They couldn't reproduce. They could not bring back any hope to their country. So it's amazing what happened if you look at these numbers in the certain countries as World War I went on.